No body cam exists, Your Honor. Without video, my report is the truth, every single time.
This police officer walked into court calm, confident, and completely unbothered, because he believed one missing body cam recording would protect him from everything that happened that night. He sat there in uniform, shoulders relaxed, answering questions like this was just another routine appearance. No nerves, no hesitation, no fear. Because in his mind, without video evidence, his word would always outweigh anyone else's. He told the court something very specific, very simple, very final. He said the body cam footage never existed. Not corrupted. Not lost. Not partially recorded. According to him, it was never there in the first place. And for a moment it almost worked. The civilian sitting across from him, an ordinary American with no badge, no power, no influence, looked like they were about to lose everything. A citation on paper. A version of events written entirely by the officer. And no video to prove otherwise. This is the part where most people watching think they already know how the story ends. Badge over truth. Authority over accountability. Another quiet injustice buried under paperwork and procedure. But here's what that officer didn't know when he raised his right hand and swore to tell the truth. Judge Judy already knew he was lying. Not because she guessed. Not because she assumed. But because before this case ever reached her courtroom, something had crossed her desk that the officer never expected to matter. Something he was absolutely sure no one would ever check. And it wasn't just a technical detail. It wasn't a loophole. It wasn't a theory. It was proof. Proof so quiet, so procedural, and so devastating that when it finally surfaced, it wouldn't just affect this case. It would silence the officer entirely. And the most shocking part? The officer himself helped create it. What happens next isn't about a traffic stop. It isn't about a citation. And it isn't even about a missing body cam anymore. It's about what happens when authority assumes it will never be questioned, and meets someone who knows exactly where to look. If you believe that a badge should never be stronger than the truth, hitting like on this video doesn't feel like support for a channel. Feels like common sense. The person sitting at the plaintiff's table that day didn't look like someone who belonged in a courtroom. No designer clothes. No dramatic gestures. No attitude. Just an ordinary American who had shown up because they had been told to show up. A working adult with a full-time job, bills to pay, and a life that didn't include arguing with police officers or fighting cases in court. This was someone who made a living the same way millions of Americans do. Driving. Long hours on the road. Early mornings. Late nights. Sometimes delivering food. Sometimes driving passengers. Sometimes just trying to make it home after a shift that ran longer than expected. No criminal record. No history of problems with law enforcement. No reason to believe that a routine traffic stop would turn into something that could follow them for years. According to the paperwork, it was supposed to be simple. A minor traffic stop. A brief interaction. A citation that would be handled and forgotten. That's how these things usually go. But the officer's report told a very different story. In his version of events, the civilian wasn't cooperative. He claimed they were argumentative. That they refused to comply with instructions. That their tone was confrontational. That the situation escalated because of the civilian's behavior, not his own. On paper, it read like a textbook justification, the kind that turns a simple stop into a serious allegation. And there was one line in that report that mattered more than everything else combined. The body cam malfunctioned. According to the officer, the device didn't record the interaction. No usable footage. No audio. No visual evidence. Just his written account and his sworn testimony. And for anyone who understands how these cases usually play out, that detail alone changes everything. Because without footage, the balance of power shifts instantly. It's no longer one person's word against another. It's one person's word against a uniform, a badge, and years of institutional trust. The civilian didn't raise their voice in court. They didn't interrupt. They didn't exaggerate. They spoke the way people do when they know they're already at a disadvantage, carefully, politely, almost cautiously. They explained that the stop never escalated, that they followed instructions, that they were confused when the officer suddenly accused them of being aggressive, that nothing about the encounter matched what was written in the report. But confusion doesn't carry the same weight as authority. And in cases like this, people watching from home recognize the pattern immediately. An officer's version gets typed up, signed, and treated like fact. The civilian's version becomes a dispute, a disagreement, something that needs proof to be believed. And that proof was missing. At least that's what the officer said. The civilian explained that they had never been told the body cam wasn't working during the stop. No warning. No mention. No explanation. Just a citation handed over and a situation that suddenly felt much bigger than it should have been. They weren't trying to accuse anyone. They weren't trying to cause trouble. They were just asking one question that so many Americans have asked in similar situations. How do I prove what really happened? Because this wasn't about avoiding responsibility. It wasn't about getting out of a ticket. It was about being labeled something they weren't: aggressive, non-compliant, difficult, based on a story they say never happened. And once that label exists on paper, it doesn't disappear easily. It follows you. It affects how future interactions go. It changes how you're treated. This is the moment where the audience stops watching passively. Because this isn't a rare scenario. It's not extreme. It's not sensational on the surface. It's familiar. It's the kind of situation where viewers think back to their own lives. A late-night drive, flashing lights in the rearview mirror, that sudden feeling of your stomach dropping as you pull over and hope everything stays calm. If you've ever thought, even for a second, this could have been me, subscribing doesn't feel like clicking a button. It feels like staying connected to stories that matter to people like you. The officer, meanwhile, appeared completely unshaken. He stood by every word of his report. He didn't hesitate. He didn't soften his language. He didn't suggest uncertainty. He presented his version of events as settled fact, supported by years on the job and confidence that comes from knowing how the system usually works. To him, this case was already over. No footage meant no contradiction. No contradiction meant no consequences. And from the outside, it looked exactly like the kind of case where the truth doesn't lose because it's wrong. It loses because it can't be proven. At least that's what everyone thought walking into that courtroom. What no one could see yet was that this wasn't just a dispute between a civilian and an officer. It was the beginning of a much bigger problem, one that would force every word spoken under oath to be tested, not by opinion, but by something the officer never believed would resurface. The officer didn't look like someone worried about being caught in a lie. In fact, if you didn't know the details of the case, you might have assumed he was there to testify against someone else. His posture was upright but relaxed. His tone was steady. His answers came without hesitation. This wasn't nervous confidence or forced composure. It was the kind of calm that comes from believing you're untouchable. When he spoke, he didn't raise his voice. He didn't sound defensive. He spoke the way authority figures are trained to speak, measured, professional, and just technical enough to discourage follow-up questions. Every sentence felt rehearsed, not because it was memorized but because it had been said before in situations just like this. He explained the stop as routine. He described the interaction as escalating. He used phrases that sounded official but vague enough to leave room for interpretation. Non-compliant behavior. Failure to follow verbal commands. Officer safety concerns. Words that don't paint a picture but don't need to, because they're rarely questioned. And then came the subject that mattered more than anything else. The body cam. When asked about it, the officer didn't hesitate for even a second. He didn't ask for clarification. He didn't qualify his answer. He said it plainly. No footage exists. Not that it was damaged. Not that it cut out midway. Not that it was inconclusive. According to him, the body cam failed entirely. He explained it as a system error. A technical malfunction. One of those things that just happen sometimes. Anyone who's worked with equipment knows it's not perfect, he said. Devices fail. Files corrupt. Batteries die. And in his telling, this was simply one of those unfortunate but unavoidable moments. What made it unsettling wasn't just what he said, it was how easily he said it. There was no frustration in his voice. No irritation. No concern that a crucial piece of evidence was missing. He spoke as if the absence of footage was an inconvenience for the civilian, not a problem for him. As if the case could still be decided fairly without it, because in his mind, it could. He repeated the point again when pressed. There is no footage. The system malfunctioned. It happens. Each repetition came out smoother than the last, as if the words were settling into place, becoming more solid every time they were spoken aloud. And for a moment it worked. Because confidence has a way of filling in gaps where evidence should be. The civilian watched quietly as the officer spoke. No interruptions. No outbursts. Just a look that suggested disbelief mixed with resignation. Because when someone speaks with that level of certainty, backed by a uniform and years of experience, it doesn't feel like a disagreement anymore. Feels like a conclusion. This is where doubt starts to creep in for the audience. Not doubt about the civilian's character, but doubt about the system itself. Is the officer protected by procedure? Is this just how these cases always go? Or is something being hidden behind professional language and calm delivery? The officer's confidence didn't come across as anger or hostility. It was colder than that. More controlled. The kind of confidence that doesn't need to prove itself because it assumes belief is automatic. He didn't argue. He stated facts, or at least what he wanted everyone to accept as facts. When questioned about department policy, he answered without blinking. When asked about standard procedures, he recited them smoothly. When the possibility of checking other records was mentioned, he showed no visible concern. Because in his mind, everything led back to the same conclusion. No footage means no contradiction. No contradiction means no accountability. And this is the part that makes him difficult to like. Not because he's loud. Not because he's aggressive. But because he's comfortable. Comfortable knowing that most people don't understand how these systems work. Comfortable knowing that missing footage rarely triggers deeper investigation. Comfortable knowing that when it's his word against the civilians, the scales usually tilt in his favor before the case even begins. Yet there was something else happening beneath the surface, something subtle enough that only a few people would notice. The officer's answers were consistent, but they were also rigid. Every explanation led to the same endpoint. Every question circled back to the same excuse. There was no variation. No uncertainty. No room for alternative explanations. That kind of consistency can look like honesty. Or it can look like preparation. And as the officer continued speaking, maintaining that calm, professional tone, the room began to feel different. Not because anything explosive had happened yet, but because nothing had. The absence of tension started to feel intentional. The lack of emotion began to feel calculated. This wasn't a man reacting to events as they unfolded. This was someone who believed the most dangerous part of the case had already been neutralized. Someone who thought the story was finished the moment the footage disappeared. The question lingering in the air wasn't whether the officer believed his own words. It was whether anyone would ever be able to prove otherwise. And for now, that answer remained hidden, buried somewhere between confidence, procedure, and a missing piece of evidence that everyone was being told never existed at all. Up until this point, the courtroom had followed a familiar rhythm. Questions were asked. Answers were given. Statements were made with confidence. And the officer seemed perfectly comfortable inside that structure. He had done this before. He knew how these exchanges usually went. He expected challenge, yes, but not disruption. Then Judge Judy leaned forward. Her tone didn't change. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't accuse him of anything. In fact, if someone wasn't paying close attention, they might have thought she was simply clarifying details. But the questions she asked next weren't broad or philosophical. They were precise, technical, specific in a way that immediately narrowed the room. She asked about the Bodycam model. Not generally. Not a Bodycam. The exact model. The officer answered without hesitation. He named it confidently, the way someone does when they believe they're on safe ground. He even added a brief explanation, just enough to sound knowledgeable, just enough to reinforce the image of a professional who understands his equipment. Judge Judy nodded once. Then she asked about the upload process. Again, not vaguely. Not how footage is handled. She asked when the footage uploads, where it uploads, and what happens if the upload fails. The officer responded smoothly. According to him, footage is transferred at the end of the shift. If the system malfunctions, there may be nothing to retrieve. He emphasized that it's automated, technical, and sometimes unreliable. Still calm. Still composed. Then came the next question. End of shift procedure. What exactly happens to the camera when the shift ends? Is it docked? Logged? Signed off? Are there checks? Are there confirmations? Are there records that indicate whether a camera was worn, activated, or connected? The officer answered confidently again, but this time something changed. Not in his words. In his timing. There was a pause. Small enough to miss. Long enough to matter. He gave an answer that sounded correct. Reasonable. Standard. But the confidence he'd carried earlier had sharpened into something tighter, more controlled. He wasn't just answering anymore. He was managing the answers. And Judge Judy noticed. She didn't interrupt him. She didn't correct him. She didn't react at all. She simply listened. Eyes steady. Expression unreadable. The kind of stillness that doesn't signal confusion. It signals calculation. Then she stopped asking questions. That's when the power shifted. The courtroom went quiet, but not awkwardly so. It was the kind of silence that feels intentional, as if the conversation had reached a point where nothing more needed to be said, at least not yet. The officer stood there, waiting for the next challenge, the next pushback, the next accusation. None came. Instead, Judge Judy leaned back slightly and looked at him the way someone looks at a puzzle they've already solved, but haven't revealed yet. She wasn't angry. She wasn't skeptical. She wasn't impressed. She was patient. The officer, sensing the pause, continued to stand confidently. From his perspective, silence meant success. It meant there was nothing left to question. Nothing left to expose. He had answered everything cleanly. He had followed procedure. He had explained the malfunction. And in cases like this, silence usually means acceptance. But this wasn't that kind of silence. It was the silence that comes after the right questions have already been asked. The civilian watched from their seat, unsure what to make of it. The audience felt it too, that subtle tightening in the room, the shift from debate to anticipation. Because when Judge Judy speaks quickly, you prepare to respond. When she stops speaking altogether, you prepare for something else. This is the moment viewers usually stop blinking, because when Judge Judy gets quiet, something big is coming. The officer didn't know it yet, but the conversation had already moved past his testimony. The answers he gave weren't being weighed anymore. They were being compared. Tested against something that hadn't been mentioned but clearly existed. Judge Judy glanced down at the paperwork in front of her. Not to read it, but to confirm it. A brief look. A subtle nod to herself. Then she looked back up. Still nothing. No reaction. No ruling. No reveal. Just silence. And in that silence, the officer's confidence began to feel exposed. Because confidence thrives on engagement. On challenge. On response. When none comes, it has nowhere to go. It just sits there, waiting, slowly realizing that it might not be in control of the room after all. The trap hadn't been sprung yet. But it had already been set. And everyone in that courtroom, especially the officer, was about to learn that silence can be far more dangerous than accusation, especially when it belongs to someone who already knows the truth. The silence didn't last long. Judge Judy broke it without changing her tone, without announcing a revelation, without giving the officer any warning that the ground beneath him was about to shift. She didn't challenge his character. She didn't accuse him of lying. She simply reached for the next piece of paper. Dispatch logs. She began reading them slowly, methodically, as if this were just another routine step. Dates. Times. Unit numbers. Call codes. Nothing dramatic on the surface. The officer stood comfortably, listening, waiting for the moment to pass. From his perspective, logs were harmless. Administrative. Background noise. Then Judge Judy read the time stamp. The exact minute the traffic stop began. The precise moment the interaction ended. And the window when bodycam footage would normally be logged. She looked up and asked a simple question. Does this time frame sound correct to you? The officer answered yes. That's when the first crack appeared. Judge Judy moved on to the officer's written report. Not the narrative summary, the technical section most people skip over. She read a single line out loud. Calmly. Clearly. No emphasis. No sarcasm. A line that stated the officer had reviewed the footage before completing the report. The room shifted. It wasn't loud. It wasn't sudden. But you could feel it. The kind of shift where people stop adjusting in their seats. Where breathing gets quieter. Where attention sharpens. Judge Judy looked at the officer again. If there was no footage, she asked, what exactly were you reviewing? For the first time, the officer hesitated. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't obvious. But it was there. A fraction of a second too long. A pause that didn't exist earlier. He cleared his throat and explained that the phrase was standard language. That it didn't necessarily mean video footage. That it could refer to notes, memory, or the overall incident. His voice was still controlled, but now it was tighter. Judge Judy didn't argue with him. She didn't contradict him. She let him speak. And as he continued explaining, something changed. His answers grew longer, more detailed, less precise. He began filling space. Defensiveness has a sound. It's the sound of someone talking around a problem instead of through it. Judge Judy moved on to another document. More timestamps. Another reference to the Bodycam. Another technical notation that assumed footage existed at some point in the process. She didn't accuse him of falsifying anything. She simply placed the information on the table, piece by piece, and waited. The officer shifted his weight. His posture changed. His shoulders tightened. He began speaking faster, explaining procedures again, repeating phrases he had already used earlier in the hearing, emphasizing how often equipment fails, how common malfunctions are. And then he made the mistake. Trying to reassert control, he said it, not angrily, not loudly, but firmly, as if it should end the discussion altogether. "Officers don't lie, Your Honor." The reaction was immediate. Not from Judge Judy, but from the room. There was an audible shift. A collective response that didn't need words. Because that statement wasn't just a defense of himself. It was a challenge. A declaration that his position alone should be enough. That the question itself was inappropriate. Judge Judy looked at him for a long moment. Then she responded, not by raising her voice, but by narrowing the issue to a single point of truth. "This court doesn't decide cases based on professions," she said. "It decides them based on facts." The officer had crossed the line without realizing it. By invoking the badge instead of the evidence, he had placed himself against the very thing the courtroom was built to protect. And the audience felt it. Because Americans don't react well when authority asks for belief without proof. This is the moment when everything changes. Up until now there was still room for doubt. For technical explanations. For system failures. But the moment he said, "Officers don't lie," the case stopped being about a missing recording and became about credibility itself. And credibility, once questioned, doesn't recover easily. Judge Judy didn't rule yet. She didn't reveal anything new. But the direction of the case was no longer ambiguous. The officer had stopped defending the facts and started defending himself. And that shift was impossible to ignore. This is where most people hit like, not because they're told to, but because when power challenges the truth instead of proving it, the public reacts instinctively. The officer didn't realize it yet, but the protection he believed the missing footage provided had just disappeared. Because when someone leans on authority instead of evidence, they invite a closer look. And Judge Judy was done looking at paperwork. She was about to look somewhere else entirely. Judge Judy didn't raise her voice. She didn't accuse the officer of lying. She didn't even sound confrontational. She said it calmly, almost casually. "I didn't ask if you had the footage." The officer looked up. "I asked your department." The words landed heavier than anything that had been said all day. For the first time since the hearing began, the officer didn't respond immediately. His mouth opened slightly, then closed again. The confidence he'd carried from the moment he walked in didn't vanish all at once. It stalled, like a machine that suddenly realized it was running without power. Judge Judy continued, still composed, still controlled. She explained that modern body cam systems don't rely solely on an officer's discretion. That footage isn't just stored on a device. It's logged, tracked, uploaded automatically. Backed up in places most people never think to check. And when questions arise, departments don't guess, they verify. She had done exactly that. Not by calling the officer. Not by asking for permission. But by requesting records directly from the department's technical unit. Automatic backup servers. Upload logs. Independent retrieval systems. Systems designed specifically so footage doesn't simply disappear because someone says it did. The officer stood still as she spoke. His shoulders were no longer relaxed. His posture stiffened as if bracing for impact. The courtroom felt smaller now, tighter, as if the walls themselves were closing in. Then Judge Judy nodded once. And said the words that ended everything. "Play the footage." The screen came on. No dramatic build-up. No warning. Just video. The footage showed the traffic stop from start to finish. The flashing lights. The pulled-over vehicle. The officer approaching. The civilian sitting calmly, hands visible, voice steady. There was no aggression. No refusal. No confrontation. Just a normal interaction, until the officer's tone shifted. The courtroom watched in silence. The officer on the screen gave instructions that were already being followed. His voice grew sharper not because of danger but impatience. The civilian remained calm, confused, asking questions instead of arguing. And then came the moment that contradicted everything the officer had testified to under oath. A comment. Not shouted. Not dramatic. But deliberate. A line that revealed intent. A tone that made it clear the escalation wasn't a reaction, it was a choice. The contrast was undeniable. What the officer had described in court didn't match what everyone was seeing with their own eyes. Not even close. The calm civilian. The composed demeanor. The absence of threat. Every second of footage quietly dismantled the story that had been so confidently presented earlier. The officer didn't look at the screen. He stared straight ahead. His jaw tightened. His face went blank. The same man who had spoken without hesitation minutes earlier now stood completely still, as if movement itself might make things worse. There was nothing to explain. Nothing to reinterpret. Nothing to argue. Because video doesn't care about authority. It doesn't care about confidence. It doesn't care about titles. It only shows what happened. Judge Judy didn't interrupt the footage. She let it play. Every second. Every detail. Long enough for the truth to settle into the room and remove any remaining doubt. When it ended, she didn't speak right away. Neither did the officer. The silence was absolute. No shifting. No murmurs. No reactions. Just the quiet aftermath of a lie collapsing in real time. The officer's earlier words echoed back in the minds of everyone watching. No footage exists. System error. It happens. Statements that had sounded reasonable when no one could challenge them, now exposed as deliberate falsehoods. Judge Judy finally looked up. Not at the screen. At the officer. Her expression didn't show anger. It showed certainty. In that moment, the case stopped being about a citation or a traffic stop or even a body cam. It became about credibility, and credibility had just been erased in front of everyone. The officer said nothing. He couldn't. Because there is no defense for a lie once the truth is playing on a screen, frame by frame, proving that everything said under oath was designed to mislead. And in that silence, heavy, complete, unavoidable, the entire power dynamic flipped. The badge didn't matter anymore. The uniform didn't matter anymore. Only the truth did. And it had finally been seen. The courtroom remained quiet long after the footage ended. Judge Judy didn't rush the moment. She didn't react emotionally. She didn't lecture. She allowed the truth to sit where it belonged, fully visible, impossible to ignore. Then she spoke, and when she did, her words were precise and final. She addressed the officer first. Not his badge. Not his years of service. Not his intentions. His credibility. She explained, calmly and clearly, that this court does not tolerate false testimony, especially from someone entrusted with enforcing the law. The issue was no longer a disputed traffic stop. It was no longer a disagreement between two versions of events. The evidence had removed all ambiguity. The officer had testified under oath that no footage existed. That statement was false. And because of that, every other claim he made became unreliable. Judge Judy dismissed the case without hesitation. The citation was thrown out entirely. The civilian was cleared of every allegation attached to the stop. No fines. No penalties. No marks on their record. Just relief, and something far more valuable than that. Vindication. Then Judge Judy turned back to the officer. She didn't threaten him. She didn't speculate about consequences beyond her courtroom. She simply stated the facts. That his testimony would be referred. That credibility lost in court does not recover easily. And that when authority lies, it damages far more than a single case. The officer stood silently as the ruling was delivered. No defense. No explanation. No appeal to authority. The same confidence he walked in with never returned. It couldn't. Because confidence built on dishonesty collapses the moment it's exposed. As the hearing concluded, the civilian finally exhaled. The tension that had followed them into the courtroom dissolved in a single moment. Not because they had won, but because the truth had finally been acknowledged. Their name cleared. Their account validated. Their voice, for once, heard at the same volume as the uniform across from them. But the story didn't end there. Outside the courtroom, the footage didn't stay contained. It spread. Quietly at first. Then rapidly. shared across platforms, replayed, analyzed, discussed. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was undeniable. An internal affairs investigation was opened shortly after. Procedures were reviewed. Testimony was examined. The same systems the officer believed protected him were now documenting everything he had said and done. The video became a reminder of why bodycams exist in the first place. Not to protect officers from civilians, and not to protect civilians from officers, but to protect the truth from disappearing. For the civilian, life returned to normal. They went back to work, back to routines, back to being an ordinary American who just wanted to be treated fairly. But now, when their story was told, it ended differently. Not with frustration, not with disbelief, but with proof. And for the officer, something irreversible had happened. Trust, once broken, doesn't reset at the end of a shift. This case wasn't about hating law enforcement. It wasn't about attacking authority. It was about accountability, the kind that applies to everyone, especially those entrusted with power. Because authority without honesty isn't authority at all. It's just a uniform. Stories like this resonate because they tap into something deeply American. The belief that no one is above the truth, and that justice doesn't belong to the loudest voice or the highest rank. It belongs to the facts. If you want more courtroom stories where power meets accountability, where the truth doesn't get buried and silence doesn't win, subscribing isn't optional. It's how you stay part of this. Because the next case, the next lie, the next moment where authority assumes no one is watching, those stories are coming. And you won't want to miss them.